Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over some quick housekeeping and accessibility information. So for anyone who needs them, captions are available in Zoom. You can click the Show Captions button at the bottom of your Zoom menu bar to turn them on. Captions are also going to be running at captionviewer.net. The URL is too long to read, but hopefully, Cart, would you be able to post that link in our chat? We also have ASL interpreters available today. We will be presenting in gallery view, so interpreters should always be visible and you do not need to pin them. Please know that we have two interpreters, so if you pin the current interpreter, it could prevent you from seeing the active interpreter after an interpreter change. You do not necessarily need to be on Zoom to access this event. We will read all questions out loud and voice any images over the screen. So that all the content will be available to individuals calling in on the phone or who cannot see visual content. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel after the end of the webinar. We will be answering questions towards the end of our discussion, and we ask that all of our audience members use the Q&A tab to address any questions you have for our panelists. We will read those questions out loud as they come in. And then finally, we use both person with disability and disabled person interchangeably, kind of recognizing people's different preferences for person first or identity first language. And so with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So hello to everyone. We thank you for joining us for our Understanding Ableism webinar series hosted by the King County Disability Consortium and the Disability Empowerment Center. My names are Sarah Marshall. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving at the Disability Empowerment Center as the KCDC coordinator. I am a young woman in my 20s. I am white. I have short brown hair. I'm wearing a pair of gray headphones and a red sweater with a silver necklace today. We'll move on to the introduction of our panelists, but first I'd like to give a bit of background into ableism, just kind of as a concept. So to draw on a definition from disability researcher Ian Langtree, who defines ableism as a complex system of beliefs, practices, and institutional structures that position disability as inherently negative while simultaneously privileging non-disabled bodies and minds as the standard against which all others are measured. And so with this definition in mind, the Understanding Ableism series was created to explore how ableism shows up in our policies, communities, and everyday interactions. Each session brings together community members and advocates to share lived experiences and practical knowledge with the hope of helping us all move towards a more inclusive and accessible King County. And for this month's topic, we are going to explore how accommodations are understood, implemented, and experienced across different settings, whether that be the workplace, the school systems, or community spaces. While accommodations are often discussed as a primary solution for accessibility, they are also shaped by broader assumptions about disability, inclusion, and who systems are designed to support. Throughout this discussion, our panelists will reflect on the possibilities and limitations of accommodations-based approaches to access, as well as consider what it means to move towards a more proactive and inclusive form of accommodations. So with that, I will ask our panelists to introduce themselves with their names and pronouns, a short visual description, and what their connection is to this topic. And we will go in order of who is listed on the PowerPoint, which will be Cecelia, Elizabeth, and then Kimberly. And I will also quickly paste the questions we will be asking in the chat for anyone who would like to reference those. So Cecelia, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cecelia Black. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a white woman in my late 30s with a long blonde hair, and I am wearing a headset, and I am in my office right now at King County, and that's blurred back in the background. I am the ADA and Disability Equity Specialist at King County. I'm one of three ADA and Disability Equity Specialists that are housed within the executive department. I've been here at the county for about 6 months, and prior to that, I worked at Disability Rights Washington, and I'm also a quadriplegic and wheelchair user.
Elizabeth, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you. Just a quick check. Can everyone hear me okay? My name is Elizabeth Miller. Ellie for short. Call me by my many names is pretty much how I refer to myself at this point. I'm a disabled current housing voucher recipient living in King County. My background currently, after 50 years of medical gaslighting, I discovered that I've been living with a genetic variant called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. This has affected my entire life, everything from the medical complex to the work complex to my housing situation currently. I have as soon as I was diagnosed, very ambitiously started volunteering and waving my EDS freak flag everywhere. I've done as much volunteer work as I can in the capacity that I have. My master's degree is in creative writing. I'm a former college and high school English ESL creative writing teacher and also a somatic movement artist. Um, since I was 18, I have also been a movement educator, strongly advocating for inclusion in movement spaces. And all of these things have interwoven now to has come back into full fruition. So I hope that my shared lived experiences will help today. Also, I go by she, her, or they, them. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Kimberly Meck, and I am the Executive Director of Disability Empowerment Center. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a white female sitting in my office with my hair pulled back. Have a gray shirt on and a black vest. Um, and I guess I'm an accommodation user as well as an individual who helps others advocate for accommodations. Um, Exposed to accommodations pretty much throughout my entire life.
This is Sarah speaking. Just some quick troubleshooting. I'm going to try and reshare my screen and see if this makes a difference, since it doesn't seem like the ASL interpreters are visible. Let's see. Okay. So we'll try and do a side by side, and hopefully the questions and then the spotlighted people should still be visible at an acceptable size. So let us know if this isn't something that will work, but hopefully this will fix the problem.
I'm not Sarah. This is Kimberly. I'm sorry. I'm hoping to troubleshoot. I
Mhm.
don't know that that's going to work either. What does standard do? Because that just makes you bigger and it makes you the same size as your PowerPoint.
Hmm. Yes, but I'm hoping that if we have an ASL interpreter, is the ASL interpreter not also visible?
They're not also visible. They're visible up in the gallery, but they're not visible side by side with you.
Okay.
Let me see if I can give Jim the ability to pin. One sec.
Thank you all for your patience as we iron out this kink.
I can't give him the ability to pin, but if you go to his name in the participant list and click on the three buttons, You should see giving him the ability to pin a lot of multi-pin.
Let's see. I can promote him to a panelist.
No, that's not the way to do it. Let's see here. Jim, we're working on it. Give us a quick second. Um, does that help, Jim? Yeah, Jim, for some reason, we don't have the ability to let you pin. Neither Sarah nor I can allow you to pin, unfortunately.
We could try to promote him to a panelist and see if that would make a difference.
Let me see if I can allow him. I'm just gonna check and see on like somebody else real quick. Yeah. Why can we not allow Jim to pin? Hmm. Sarah, go ahead and make it back to gallery view for a second. One second, y'all. Sorry about this. Sarah, did you make the view gallery view again? There we go. Does that help, Jim? Sorry, folks, we're all about accommodation and access, so making sure that everybody can participate. Sarah, you're muted.
Okay, hopefully it's visible now. Okay, perfect. Then we will move on to our first question. So asking all of our panelists, how do you define accommodations, and how has your understanding of that term evolved through your work or your lived experiences? And we'll start with Cecelia.
Hello, this is Cecelia speaking. Um, I guess we'll start with the definition, just very basic. Accommodations are adjustments or modifications to programs or jobs to make sure that people with disabilities can fully participate or fully do their job or and fully access services. And I've been, trying to think about how my understanding of accommodations have evolved. I think that when we think about accommodations, we have like a very I think I automatically think of like very narrowly defined of like what is accommodation. I think like ASL is, one accommodation that we automatically think about, those of us that work around accommodations and in the disability community. Um, but I really am beginning to understand that they can be just much broader than that. I think about for myself as a manual wheelchair user, we have a return to office policy where we work 3 days in office, and it's just very hard for me to push a wheelchair in the rain, which is unfortunate that I chose Seattle to live. And so one of my accommodations that I requested was that there's flexibility when the weather and the rain is really bad, so I'll be able to work from home. And I think that, several years ago, I wouldn't have thought about weather as an accommodation. I would have thought, um, yeah, thinking I yeah would have uh, defined or thought about what is accommodation much more narrowly, and so I think my views of how we define accommodations and how we get really creative and making sure that we are serving everybody. Yeah, I'll give like one more example. I am on a, a research panel review committee of a research project that is increasing the goal is to increase uh, people with disabilities working in the transportation sector. And one of the examples that this research project gave was from TriMet, which is a transit agency organization in Portland. And they had, for the paratransit services, they have operators, a couple operators who are autistic. And their policy is that for paratransit operators, their benchmark is to have all rides completed within 95% um, time of the full service time. And so this was adding a lot of pressure to people with autism to just constantly be thinking about this 95% delivery time. And so what they did was they decreased that to 85%. And um, I think often people would see that as a changing the job duty or making service less available to accommodate employees with disabilities. But what they found was when they reduced this like high pressure number for operators, was that all of the operators had you know completed all of their rides within the full service delivery time, but they also had zero complaints and zero safety issues, which was less than the general operating pool. And so I think that's just like another example of I think that most employers want to automatically think about, okay, let's change this metric that we have placed on job quality and the job position and ability to complete the job. And if we adjust that a little bit, we actually have not just inclusive employment, but we have employees that are doing a better job than the average of all operators.
It's, oh, I'm having I'm having some issues with my camera. Can you see me now? This is Elizabeth Miller. You can call me Ellie again. Also to give a quick visual because my nerves have gotten the better of me a little bit this morning. Just for a visual, I have strawberry-ish blonde hair. I'm considered a ginger to some. I have freckles. I am legally listed as white. My genetic tests prove otherwise at this point, which confirms some things I've been pondering my entire life. I am wearing a full body mobility aid, a black shirt, compression tights, a cervical collar, and I have ring splints on each hand right now. To answer this question, how do I define accommodations and how has my understanding of that term evolved through my work or lived experience? I can't at this present moment even get the property management team to uphold their side of our agreed upon lease agreements from 3 years ago when I moved in here, much less an accommodation. I used to thought that accommodations, if they were upheld in theory, were great. Now I'm not so sure. I wonder if we are asking, maybe we need to redirect the question to ponder the actual lattice work and framework of our society. My introduction to asking for what I needed at 5 years old, entering the Dade County public school system, not knowing I was living with a genetic tissue variant, nor did I know yet that I was considered neurospicy. I also happened to be left-handed. And I asked Mrs. Paramore, my kindergarten teacher, if it was possible to get left-handed scissors. For those that, I will try to give a visual. If you are considered hypermobile, chances are gripping a pen can be almost impossible. When I asked this question to Mrs. Paramore, my kindergarten teacher, I was immediately told, we can't accommodate everyone. And then she proceeded to pull out a ruler and beat my knuckles in front of the class. And I learned at 5 years old, entering any kind of institutionalized public school setting, that if I was going to survive, I needed to keep my mouth shut, that it was not okay to ask for what I need, and that I would be reprimanded for doing so. That was my introduction into what I now call ableism, before I ever knew I had been considered disabled by the government, by the medical model of disability, by society, and by my very own family unit. How has this evolved? Ableism is in everything in my daily life. I have considered it death by a million paper cuts. The most prevalent place I probably experience ableism is asking my specialist, the specialist I do have access to as a permanently disabled human being, who needs these things documented to then navigate the rest of the world. 99.9% of all of my specialists do not even know how to fill out a reasonable accommodation form. So I take spoons of energy I do not have, educating the very providers whose signatures I need to legally navigate the rest of the world, whether it's through Seattle housing, through a work accommodation, through a teaching environment. From my experience, even with Medicare and Medicaid recently, there is a pattern recognition I have seen where the accommodations might be there, but when things seem to run on a 12-month calendar, whether that's through the medical complex and insurance, through housing recertifications every year, deny, delay, ask for more documentation. And there's a clock ticking down. So while I'm being distracted going out and getting reasonable accommodation forms from specialists to then turn into, whether it's an employer, a property management team, or anywhere else it may be needed, usually it's met with, we don't understand what that is. We need more certification. And there goes another 3 to 6 months of me trying to get documentation from my ill-informed, ignorant doctors who are supposed to be advocating on my behalf. And you see where that goes. No accountability is ever taken, and the calendar year ends, and now we start the whole process over. So my personal lived experience now is that accommodations sound great in theory, but is anyone actually applying them? Not in my experience. That's pretty much where I stand on accommodations right now. Thank you.
This is Kimberly. Cecelia gave a very good definition of what an accommodation is. It's not necessarily what it's seen by, though, by most employers. Most employers, in a lot of cases, fear the word accommodation, thinking that it's going to be something that's expensive or that will take too much time or potentially could be inconvenient for themselves or the person who's asking for accommodations colleagues. Um, I spent most of my working life teaching people how to ask for accommodations and recognizing that accommodations could help them do their job more effectively, um, or easier for themselves. Um, accommodations don't have to be something that's expensive. I think about people who don't drive because of their disability, and take the bus. And, if the shift starts at 9, but the first bus gets the person there at either 9:05 or 8:05, and they can't get in until the building opens at 9, then it's the difference between somebody being 5 minutes late or somebody who has to sit outside in the weather for nearly an hour before they can enter their workplace. Um, and those are simple, little, easy accommodations that could be asked for. Obviously there are accommodations that can be expensive, computer software, specific furniture, desks or tables or things like that. But they don't always have to cost a lot. There are a lot of ways to work around things. I call them MacGyver fixes when it comes to trying to figure out how to make a workaround. Especially when I get met by somebody saying, well, we can't do that, or that's not possible, or that's too expensive. It's not considered reasonable for us. I never knew that I needed accommodations until I was actually diagnosed with my disability, and I was 35 when I finally found out what my disability is. I think, unfortunately, a lot of easy accommodations could be done through universal design. Um, having door openers, having, thoughts to lighting or quiet spaces in workplaces, thinking about acoustics in a building can help with accommodations for people who have hearing loss or who are deaf. It can be so simple. Um, Sorry, Jim, I see your, oh, I apologize. I was looking at chat. I apologize. I just wish that people would, and when I guess I say people, I think about employers, that when somebody comes to them and asks them for an accommodation, that they don't immediately close their mind or automatically go to the worst case scenario. I honestly also wish that employers would think more about the health of their workers and think about their workers and employees as assets to a company rather than a liability. I think we might get a lot more cooperation if all employers saw their employees as something that benefited the company rather than something that they had to take care of or do something with, in order to make their company operate. So.
This is Sarah. Thank you to our panelists for your responses. I think you all touched on something interesting about accommodations, which is that it's a very broad term that encompasses a lot of different actions and assistive technologies and practices. So it's definitely an umbrella term to describe things that are either very amorphous or very seemingly obvious, but definitely doesn't always make it easy when defining and then implementing, strategies for accommodations. So we'll move on to our next question, which is, what are some common misconceptions about accommodations that you encounter in your work or daily life? And I know that we've touched on these, but curious to hear more about where you guys see some of these shortcomings.
Hi, this is Cecilia speaking. Um, yeah, Kimberly just touched on, like, just gave so many um, great examples and responses and comments to this. So I'm like trying to think about, what can I add to what Kimberly already touched on, and also what Elizabeth said about having, we are in a society that was where all of our programs and our jobs are created for very specific people, and that's generally been, a white man that has a wife at home that's able to do all the extra tasks, a white non-disabled man. And so I think that in thinking about that, uh just there's just a common misconception that, like Kimberly said, um accommodations are expensive. Accommodations, if we're talking about um, employment and employees, accommodations will lower the expectation of what employees can do and their quality of work. Um, and accommodations are just burdensome extra services and programs that we need to provide to people with disabilities. And I think, like, again, what Kimberly said is that there's, so many accommodations that are just easy fixes and low cost solutions. But I think also part of this is, like, we really need to reframe like who uses accommodations, because uh, accommodations are a civil right that's protected for people with disabilities, but really, like, more broadly than that, so many people need adjustments to this very narrow definition that we have of, like, what is a good employee, or like how you access services. Um, and I think, like, another piece of that is, thinking about myself as a person with a disability, and then when I entered the workforce, no one ever like sat me down and told me, like, these are accommodations you can ask for, or this is how you fill out an accommodation report form. And I think that, like, once you show up to a job, there is like an expectation that you have experience with that you know how to you know how to fill out these forms, you know exactly what you need. And me and my friend who's also disabled were laughing that it's like we're treated like, okay, you're a disabled kid, like sixth grade. Every disabled kid learns um how to fill out accommodation request. And so I think what, like, really happens most often is people just make do without accommodations and can't be fully successful. And so I think, again, just building off of what Kimberly said is that, really trying to reframe accommodations, and really, when we're talking about employment, try to just, like, we need to emphasize that employers or employees who have all their needs met, who are able to show up work, it's not just, it is like better for the outcome. It's better for what they're doing because they're able to truly focus on their job duties. Um, uh, yeah, and I think that, just want to reemphasize that there's this idea that just accommodations are overly expensive and will fundamentally alter programs. And we see again and again that when we talk about universal design, the more broad accommodations that we can provide community, the more people, not just people with disabilities, but um, beyond that, the more people that can access our programs and services. Um, I like think about this. Uh, I think is maybe most noticeable with um, all of our uh, Zoom and virtual options that we have, and really how COVID, like, sped up the it was a catalyst for, so many meetings being offered virtually, and um, you know so many work opportunities offered virtually, and that's really benefited everybody and not just people with disabilities. It's benefited caregivers and people that aren't able to afford to live right in the middle of the city that's either next to their job or close to like abundance of transportation. And um, uh, yeah, like I think about at my previous job, I was a community organizer, and um, uh, in most of the meetings that at City Hall that we would try to turn up people to share their story and impact legislation, they were all either most of them were at 9:30, and for anybody that's disabled and has a longer morning routine, that can be really hard to get to, but also really hard for people with disabilities who rely on caregivers, especially caregivers that live outside of their home. And so finding having reliable caregiving that can come, well before this meeting started, so it was really difficult. And almost all of the people in our network who relied on caregivers would never be able to make this 9:30 these 9:30 meetings to share their story and participate um, in in our government and how legislation is getting made. And so that virtual option was just really crucial to making sure that more people can engage with government. And then, we can talk about a whole nother level of um, you know, of, of, uh, of our expectations of time and when our programs and services and work hours happen, which I think is, another another piece of how our, you know, society and how we have expectations of the job and hours is really defined. And yeah, I think I'll with that turn it over to Elizabeth.
Oops, there we go. Hi again. This is Elizabeth Ellie Miller. Oof, it's a loaded question, and I feel like my nerves have gotten a little better of me. I'm a nonlinear storyteller, and the best way from my training as a writer who survived a graduate program level of linear storytelling, who did not fit into that paradigm at all. My special is poetry. I personally believe that even our language does not accommodate our disabilities, if you will. I was actually last night re-looking up the term disabled because in my research and my writing, when I have time, the word disabled has no literal translation in most indigenous cultures. It is a construct that goes far beyond white cis hetero. If we want to widen that and get some depth of field, from my perspective, it is a colonized paradigm. It is a construct. It only has meaning because that's what we've all been conditioned to believe. For example, in Maori, I have a very special connection with Maori. I call them the first family. The word autism does not exist. The word neurodivergent does not exist. The pathos of our medical model of disability does not exist. There is no such thing as ADHD. I believe the inclusion in the language of the Maori people, what we would call in the States ADHD, they call arorintini, which paraphrase loosely means can do many things at once. Isn't that beautiful? We can do many things simultaneously. On the flip side, what the United States and colonized English would label autism, that is a word built into inclusively the Maori peoples, and that word is takiwatanga, which means in their own space and time. It is an inclusive embodying of community. From the medical model of disability, of which I do not subscribe, even the symptomology for my multiple disabilities, I believe are a causal effect from living in a toxic environment. You know, I was thinking about this because I experienced the world through spiral and metaphor and nonlinearity. I keep coming back to where my current passion with fascia science interwoven with quantum physics and geology intersect is based on the concept of paradigm shift, which stems from one of my heroes, Buckminster Fuller. If you've ever heard of geodesic domes in engineering, this is based on the premise of what some people might call solar punk. You know, to me, if the most energy efficient shape in the cosmos is a sphere, why are we all living in square boxes? When we're speaking about, as Kimberly mentioned, acoustics, I'm synesthetic and kinesthetic. It wasn't until the last 5 years, after seeing that my original neurodivergence diagnosis was incorrect, I did not yet understand that I lived with synesthesia and kinesthesia. I thought everyone could feel the electricity in the walls. I thought everyone could hear the B flat hum coming off a fluorescent light bulb, that it was also giving everybody else a migraine. How does that tie in with misconceptions about accommodations now? I think the legal framework of how we define an accommodation, and that especially catchy word, at least from Florida, reasonable accommodation. I will give briefly, as best I can, an example of what I'm currently dealing with in my home environment. I am not yet able to work because I can't find reasonable accommodations anywhere. But in my own living situation, the disabled lift in my building that was promised to me as part of my lease agreement has been broken since December 24th weekend of last year, on top of the call box, which has been broken since March of last year. The only way I can enter or exit my building is a side entrance. I'm on a grade below ground where there's uneven walkway that was an afterthought after some poured even cement. So I cannot safely use my walker to go around the perimeter of the building to the sidewalk to then be able to access things like my federal mail, the on-site laundry. I have no safe way to take out my garbage or empty my recycling. So, and if there's time allowed, this has to also apply with digital equity and inclusion. Currently, as all of this was transpiring, I recently found out that the property management team with whom I rent is apparently using a banned app and has now mandated it as their permanent resident portal. It is called realpage.com, and according to State Bill 5469, as of October last year, this app, which has been sued and banned across the United States, is owned by a private equity firm named Thoma Bravo. Thoma Bravo and realpage.com have been brought up on charges of unethical rental pricing algorithms. This is where equity and inclusion intersect with AI. I'm going to pause there because that was a lot of information, but it all ties in together. It's the same pattern over and over again. What is an accommodation if the concept of norm, the goalpost keeps changing? Norm according to whom? Even what we consider average temperature in an office, that average temperature, somewhere between 76 and 78, I presume, that was based on only cis white hetero male bodies when that figure became standard. It did not consider non-male bodies. There's a cajillion examples of this. Misconceptions about accommodations, again, is how does the legal system define reasonable? How does my landlord define reasonable? It usually comes down to money, in my experience. I am one person in a 12-unit building. It is now not cost effective to for my building management to do their part to fix the disabled lift so that I can equitably access all the amenities that were promised in my lease. And again, that leads to another question: where does a disabled person go to get an attorney? I'll leave that one there. Thank you.
This is Kimberly. Well, a lot of stuff talked about. I think I kind of answered this question with my answer to the first question. I guess I've always read ahead. Sorry about that. I guess a couple of things that I was thinking about as I was listening to the other speakers. I think one of the misconceptions is that people get scared that if they ask for an accommodation, they're going to be labeled or they're going to be potentially targeted. I think also that there are a lot of people who don't realize that an accommodation can make working easier for them. Again, some of the universal design thoughts, if an organization uses some sort of software that they have to use in making sure that it's accessible, if somebody wants to use like speech to text software or something, making sure that whatever proprietary program that company uses is compatible with the accessibility software is an important piece, and a lot of people don't think about that. I know, with my organization, whenever we introduce new IT, I always ask, well, what are the accessibility considerations? Because we have people who use accessible software. But then again, like I said, I don't think that people. I think when people hear the word accommodation, they're automatically like preconceived notions that it means that somebody's getting something extra to help them do their job. And I don't think about the accommodations that I get at my workplace to be something extra to make me be able to do my job easier or better than somebody else. I just think about it as, hey, I can actually work. And a lot of employers don't necessarily think about it that way. Thinking about access in other areas, such as housing or in like program design or things like that. Accessibility and accommodations are typically an afterthought. They're usually not thought of until somebody complains. They might have some of the more mainstream types of accommodations, like having CART or ASL, or making sure that the facility that they're having the event or class or program in, has ramps or push button doors. But they don't necessarily think about all the other pieces to it. And again, they frequently don't think about it until somebody actually complains. And then they have to go through and do the whole shift. And that, I think, is where a lot of the expense comes in. Because if you design a program and you don't have the forethought to include accessibility or accommodations into that program design, then you have to go back and figure out how you can fit it in, or look at what's the extra cost in order to make sure that it's accessible. How often have you gone to an event or something and they'll say, oh, no, we don't need microphones. People can hear me. I can talk loud enough. But they don't understand that microphones can tie into a person's cochlear implant, or having a loop system to make sure that people have full access. They don't understand that having CART can make sure that everybody is able to participate. And I think a lot of times, you know, the people who need the accommodations the most, or would benefit from it the most, don't necessarily even know what exists out there that could be an accommodation. You know, I've talked to state employees, I've talked to county employees who, and this is just an example, but who tell me that I didn't even know that that existed. I didn't even know that we could do that. And I said, well, yeah, it's an accommodation. You can ask for it. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get it, but um, you know, you can start to think through those things. You know, I remember when sit stand desks came into play and how, you know, people typically only ever thought about them for people who were in wheelchairs to raise the height of the desk for mobility equipment to be able to get underneath it. They didn't think about somebody who wanted to prefer working standing up. Um, so I think that there are a lot of misconceptions in terms of like cost and the expectation that an individual will be labeled or potentially targeted for asking for those accommodations. And I think there's a lot of fear around that. Jobs are hard enough to find already, and people don't want to do anything to potentially jeopardize their opportunities to keep their job or get a job.
This is Sarah. Thank you to all our panelists for those responses. I think though you all touched on different things, they all are very important and definitely worth further consideration. And you guys have become really good at predicting the questions I'm going to ask. So, though I know we've touched on this a bit more, where do accommodations fall short? In other words, what are the limitations of an accommodations-based approach to access?
Hi, this is Cecelia speaking. And oh my gosh, Kimberly just did such a great job explaining this, and Elizabeth gave so many examples of how accommodations fall short. So I'll try to hopefully maybe add anything that they haven't said. But I'll just start with, what Elizabeth really described is that, accommodations, the onus is on people with disabilities to know, to ask, to go through a process and ask employers or service providers what they need, and then not just ask, not just the not people with disabilities not only have to make the first step and do the extra legwork of accessing services, but they also are responsible for following up and making sure that those accommodations are in place. And that is a lot of work and a lot of effort and expectation that we don't place on people that don't need accommodations. And, for example, I have ADHD, and um, just the thought of sending an extra email to get what I need just is like can be very laborious for me. And so oftentimes, I just will go without the accommodation or not participate in the program just because that extra step is just it's just like a lot of energy that it takes me to access those programs. And so, everything that Kimberly touched on is if we design programs to be accessible from the beginning, we really take the expectation off people with disabilities to advocate for a program that's already created to meet their needs, and we put it on the program provider or the employer for create an accessible environment that can serve everybody. And we see over and over again that when um, people ask for accommodations and a program is adapted or modified or work expectations are modified, they really do benefit everybody. And I think that that's what can be so frustrating about this after the fact or um, after the program's created approach that we have to accessibility. Um, again, like thinking about working remotely, that not just benefits people with disabilities, but think about everybody that's has, like I mentioned earlier, like as a caregiver, lives far away from their places of work. And um, yeah, just when we think about accessibility from the beginning and we don't rely on after the fact accommodations, it really does benefit everybody. Right now I'm working with King County on a digital accessibility policy as we try to make sure that all of our virtual programs and information and services are accessible to everybody. And you know, King County has so much content that is not accessible, and there's really a lack of knowledge sometimes about all of the standards that we need to be thinking about when we create digital content or technologies. And so when talking to people, really trying to make sure that in the interim we have uh, a clear contact information and clear descriptions of how you can ask for accommodations if something's not accessible. And so in this process and talking to people, one of the questions or feedback that I hear is that, oh, okay, we just have to have a number or an email up there, um, and then whatever content content is accessible, or whatever content that's not accessible, that's an appropriate alternative method. Um, and I think that again, like that is placing the expectation and the extra work on people with disabilities, but it also is hugely expensive. Like Kimberly said, if we are navigating all of these phone calls and extra staff time just to make just to ensure that someone can access a PDF rather than making sure that accessibility is ingrained in how we create a PDF and how we procure technologies. It is just yes, so much more cost efficient, and then again, like benefits everybody. And so um, yeah, just to really like re-emphasize that accommodations put so much expectation on people with disabilities, and because of that, all of these misconceptions that we have about accommodations can sometimes ring true because they can be more expensive, or they can cost extra time. And if we just thought about accessibility differently and really ingrained it in what we do and made it an absolute priority, um, you know, all, all of those barriers that people feel about providing accommodations would go away, and we would really be able to serve a lot, um, a lot more people and have more people be able to access our programs and employment. Um, yeah, I would give just one more example. I have a million examples from grad school where I've just never experienced such hostility towards me asking for accommodations. And, one of them was they had a hand cycle in the gym that was only it was only reserved for student athletes. And there was so much resistance for me to use this hand cycle. Slowly they're like, okay, you can use it for 2 hours during the week. Um, and it's just like, yeah, so much extra meetings and everything about this silly like hand cycle that could have easily been made available to everybody. And you think about anyone, not just athletes, but have injured an ACL, thinking about like college students or broke their ankle. Like that is exercise equipment that so many people can benefit from. And then later in grad school, after a building was modified and not made accessible, and I was unable to get testing accommodations. I had a meeting with the dean, and I titled my email request for the meeting was just discrimination. And when I met with the dean, his first question to me was, how many people are like you at the school anyways? And I told him that if a blind student comes next year, um, they're going to have a whole different set of issues. It's going to be under the same umbrella of accessibility and discrimination, but they're going to have a whole different set of issues because we're not thinking about accessibility from the beginning and not serving our students. And so I think that, everything that Elizabeth said, we really need to redefine who gets to be in our society, in our communities, in our workforce, and um, and really think about, you know, the extra um, work that we place on people with disabilities. And I guess just like, at King County, one thing that we are trying to be cognizant of is really providing support for people trying to fill out accommodations where um, uh, if someone reaches out to us, again, like they have to do the first step of letting us know, but trying to make sure that people are available to write down those accommodations and not place that expectation on a person with disability. And that way, we have what we need, a documented request, but it's not, but we're not expecting the community to necessarily fill those out without help. And so it's still within this accommodations-based model, but really trying to think about how we can remove those barriers for people to request accommodations.
There we go. Is it my turn? Thank you for patience. I'm actually going into a spasm as this webinar has been going on. So can everyone hear me and see me? I'm afraid that I might have lost connection here.
You're good.
Okay, thank you. I'm also trying to keep my foot from completely, although I'm very bendy, it's wanting to go past the point of no return. Speaking of accommodations and how they fall short, I keep thinking of Nina Simone's beautiful phrasing. Uh, we need to know when to get up from the table when love is no longer being served. From a colonizer point of view, I don't think love has ever been served towards the disabled community in the United States. And when I speak about ableism, I'm really including all the isms, just to clarify that. Ableism to me is the disco tea party where all the other isms come and hang out. And as Monty Barberin states it in the best, most eloquent way possible, the only difference between you and me is time and luck. Where accommodations fall short is again, this all points back to Buckminster Fuller. Why have we built our society around predominantly neurotypical colonizer extraction models? I think, I can't, the biggest gift in this journey for me and the most uncomfortable really starts and ends with me, and not just how I perceive myself, but how I perceive what is reasonable accommodation. From the beginning of my life until the present day, I was told many false narratives about me, towards me, that were all incorrect. Again, I was medically gaslit for the first 50 years of my life. I thought for some reason, once I got this Ehlers-Danlos syndrome diagnosis, that we're all on the same page now. Now I'll get the help I need, which is partly why I moved to Seattle. After the overturn of Roe, coming from Miami, Florida, and having experienced tremendous ableism there, and also knowing that I hit a few marginalized demographics, watching state bills fly through that put me in a very vulnerable position. I had hoped that coming out to Seattle, a Hedgebrook Women's Writing Center is out on Whidbey Island. That's a whole nother conversation. That was my original goal, but Whidbey doesn't seem to very much like poor people. Uh, where was I going with this? As soon as I got here, I saw very quickly that I was not going to get the help I needed in the medical complex. I was terrified of retribution, actually, for going to patient relations. I'm nervous this morning because when I again reminded myself reading everything for today's panel presentation that this would be on YouTube, I have been in fear in my own building of retaliation for simply asking for my needs to be met. At the very least, what I'm experiencing in my apartment is a breach of contract legally. The amenities that I was promised when I moved in here as a disabled person, I have all the emails from when I reached out from Miami. Pretty much 90% of what I was promised in this lease is not being upheld on their part. The call box still doesn't work. The disabled lift still doesn't work. In the meantime, though, as of I believe March of last year, suddenly this management company wanted to start charging for parking, $50 per month. Now, being that I also used to work for attorneys through grad school, and I almost married an attorney, not from that law firm, by the way. I also being my own advocate, excuse me, what I saw from that point of view was legally they can't raise the rent in this affordable housing complex, but they can create a passive income stream that bypasses the law. Suddenly now there's a passive income stream, yet there's been no improvements to this building. The one disabled person here, I'm now a deficit because they don't want to spend the money to fix the disabled lift that was promised to me and part of this. And again, this all points back to legal. What is the point of having entities like neighborhood legal clinics or Disability Rights Washington if they're not allowed to step in and serve in any capacity as legal help? I've met with King County Bar 3 times. I've met with neighborhood legal clinics twice. I've done my due diligence. I've reported the things I need to report, but I'm also sitting in fear now of retaliation. And here's how this works from my perspective on at least the rental and affordable housing complex. My 3 years here will be in October this month. So, December was when the disabled lift stopped working. I fell through the rotten fence on the side of this building and partially dislocated my shoulder, breaking my fall through the fence because of the uneven walkway. There's also a 20-foot drop next to me in an empty lot and no safety fence right there. I'm constantly getting injured just trying to stay alive in my own apartment complex. Now it looks like I can't get an attorney. I'm told and validated that I need an attorney. Actually, Seattle Housing Authority is, and here's where the fear comes in. I have gone through Seattle Housing Authority, letting them know every step of the way what's going on in this building. Their liaison team, I'm using air quotes for those that may not see my hands. Their liaison tenant team is being restructured, and the representative I was last referred to put in writing that I should get a lawyer. Now that's all wonderful. Go get a lawyer, go get a lawyer. I was actually talking about this with an access driver. Where does a disabled person go to get a lawyer? The ADA lawyers that I have reached out to, they really only represent clients who are in the process of getting their disability benefits, financially motivated by the fact that they get a really good payout on that retro pay. But once we actually become disabled, when do we have legal representation? How do we access legal representation? And with very limited spoons and no medical support for my conditions, how do I find the energy to legally represent myself? This is where my thoughts on accommodations and the legal definition of versus my lived experience, it all still comes back to greed. When we put profit over people, this is what we see. When the executive branch of our government is run by a bunch of pedophiles and nobody is being held accountable legally for what's going on, it took a lot of people looking the other way for that to happen. Which means if you take a look at the state level, at the county level, at the city level, chances are for that to be happening, it's also happening right here. So again, I'm not all too sure that we may be past the point of asking for accommodations. This is about equity and inclusion, not special treatment. This is about why, access transit as an example, if there's time allotted. When I first moved out here, I went through paratransit. That was a whole nightmare in Florida. When I came out here, I immediately signed up for access transit. My hip dislocated during the walk over at Harborview. They immediately, the OT said they passed. It was poetic timing. However, when I went through seattle.gov with my paratransit number so I could use the Transit Go app like everyone else, I found out that there were no Orca readers on the access buses. So, being that I also have an extensive background in AI writing, and I worked as an SEO optimization, fancy name for AI writing before it even had a title. I knew it was probably just a matter of a magic button. It took 4 months of me calling King County, calling Transit Go. I finally asked who 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 created the app, who created the Transit Go app, because I know somebody knows a button to push. One phone call to the people that own Transit Go app. I believe they're called Byte, BYTE. Not ByteDance. They used to own TikTok, but Byte. Um, in one phone call, they fixed it. So now I can go in and buy a reduced price ticket for Access Transit in my Transit Go app. There is not one time that I've gotten on Access Bus that other disabled passengers, people with disabilities, said, "How did you do that?" And I said, "I didn't stop asking questions, even when I'm scared." Um, How does this apply to all things AI, digital equity, and inclusion? Governor Ferguson just gave $100,000 to IonQ, which is a quantum computing company that they are hoping headquarters here in Seattle. So equity and inclusion in digital spaces is, again, I think, of utmost importance right now. Thank you for letting me wander off on a million tangents. I hope that made some sense. Thank you.
This is Kimberly again. I think where accommodations fall short is very simply a lot of what Cecelia was talking about in terms of that the onus is on the disabled people to ask for accommodations. That's why when we do these understanding ableism talks, we automatically have ASL and CART available. People don't have to ask for them to participate. I spent most of the time during COVID in pushing for building in access to vaccine locations, testing sites, getting information out about resources. Um, like like she said, like Cecelia said, the people with disabilities shouldn't have to ask for access. People who don't have disabilities don't have to ask. Um, and I think that in a lot of cases, with smaller organizations or businesses, I think it's lack of knowledge. They tell you when, you start a business that you should learn how to do a budget, that you should learn how to do whatever. There's small business classes that you can go to, but none of those classes have anything to do with accommodations or accessibility. There's not one lesson plan on ADA in order to make sure that everybody can access your facility. You know, uh, People with disabilities, whether you have a visible or an invisible disability, people with disabilities are like ghosts. We kind of just walk through this world and people don't realize that we're out there. And so a lot of people don't recognize how accommodations can be made and built in to processes or even fixed structures or things like that. They just don't understand it. And then oftentimes when you approach that, you end up getting a lot of pushback And that's where the cost comes in because, again, it wasn't designed with accessibility or accommodations in mind. And so they have to go through and fix something. I think like also like if you like run a restaurant and you wanted to get a Braille menu to have available for people who are visually impaired, the cost to get a Braille menu to get your menu translated and then printed is quite a bit. There's a great expense to it for some of the smaller businesses. And so I think that accessibility, unfortunately, can cost a lot when people are looking at it as a line item in their budget. And it has to do with the fact that they never even thought about it. I think about also the fact that when accommodations come up, quite often we're met with people telling us what accommodations will work for us. Or, I had a person who's blind before, and this is the accommodation that they wanted or they used. Or I had a person with ADHD in my class before, and this is the accommodation that they used. We're going to give you that. And I think back to my grad school experience where in my undergrad, I wasn't diagnosed, so I didn't have a disability at the time. But when I went back to grad school, I walked into the disability services and I said, okay, I don't even know what to ask for, quite frankly, because this is new. I've never had a disability before, or at least never knew I had one. And the thing that they wanted was a letter from my therapist telling them what accommodations I would benefit from. And that I think is, another issue in terms of where accommodations fall short. They're based on the medical model. They're not necessarily based on what actually would work for the person with a disability. They're based on what are the recommendations from the medical providers. And that's how they decide what you're going to get. I also think that there's a lack of common sense on a lot of things. I think about how we had an individual contact us because they were requesting an accommodation for a parking space in uh, a different. There's two parking garages on the campus of the company, and they had the ADA parking spaces in one of the buildings, but they didn't have them in the other one. And this person's office was right outside the elevator in the second building. And the company would not grant this employee an accessible parking spot in that second parking garage because they had the required minimum in the first parking garage. And they had them mostly for visitors and guests. And so they didn't want to end up having to put an accessible parking spot in the other building or in the other parking garage. And I'm just like, where's the common sense in that? You're telling this individual who has a mobility impairment, who is on oxygen 50% of the time, that they have to park in that parking garage because you've got your accessible spaces there, and you won't grant it in this other building. It blew my mind. I couldn't figure out why they wouldn't do it. So I think that again, that accommodations fall short because again, they're based on medical recommendations, so they're based on medical model. I think that there's a lot of people who don't know, a lot of business owners, people who run companies who don't know what accommodations are. And then also that oftentimes people tell us what we need rather than asking what would work best for us. or making it that whole process that it's supposed to be, which is, talking through it and discussing it and trial and error and seeing what works best. Um, I have a feeling I answered the next question too, but um, yeah.
Kimberly, you might have, known where we were going. So I think in the interest of time, oh, sorry, this is Sarah. But in the interest of time, I'm going to ask our panelists to try and keep their responses semi-brief. I know it's a very large topic, but I just want to make sure that maybe we would have time for a couple questions, though I know that we are nearing the end of the webinar. So how can organizations move from reactive accommodations to more proactive, inclusive design? What does that shift look like in practice? And just very quickly before we transition, I am going to send a link to the chat, but it's for askjan.org, which is actually a resource that Kimberly shared with me, but it's for the Job Accommodations Network, which is more centered around workplace accommodations. But for anyone who's curious about what legal accommodations are out there, it has a really useful A to Z list that categorizes it by certain medical conditions or different disabilities. And though it is not comprehensive, by any stretch, obviously disability is a very fluid identity and state of being. It is interesting and perhaps useful. So I'll send that link in the chat.
Hi, this is Cecelia. And I know Kimberly captured this question's so beautifully. So I don't know if I have much more to add, but one thing I just want to say that um, if if things are not accessible, if organizations or employers aren't able to make everything accessible, and also everybody has different needs, and not everything works for everybody. And so when those situations happen, I think that organizations need to do a much, much better job, and especially employers need to do a much better job at um, at being really welcoming and making sure that employees know that they are here to work. The employer is here to work with the disabled community or anybody that's needing accommodations, and really being proactive about their messaging of like, we are here and we want to make sure our programs and services and our jobs work for everybody, and really really investing in that messaging and making sure people know, and making sure that not just people know that your organization supports accommodation requests and is not going to be reactive and not going to be uh, a really like retaliatory or have any uh, and being really clear and really intentional about not having any negative consequences or within the culture of the employer and the program. So I think that's one thing that, if yes, we need to make sure everything is accessible from the beginning and everything that Kimberly said, but in those situations when it's not, organizations need to do a much, much better job at making sure that um, people with disabilities feel supported and welcomed when they ask for accommodations, and that there's a clear process and makes it really easy to request those accommodations.
Hi, this is Elizabeth again. Hard to, also for lack of time, reactive was the word that caught me in that question. Because usually I'm on the other side being told I'm the one being reactive when asking for accommodations. It's just hard to see it that way. Again, to me, it's a lack of ethics and putting, greed above quality of life. Um, what's considered reactive, proactive. Again, this to me goes back to more solar punk and paradigm shifting and looking at the world through biotensegrity. We are we have been separated from our symbiotic relationship with the living land. None of us, I believe, were ever meant to be under fluorescent lighting indoors in recycled air 24 hours a day, partly. So to ask for an accommodation, coming fresh out of grad school, I walked right back into corporate banking, which is what prompted me to go back that third college try and finish. And this time I came back to Wells Fargo at the time. As a treasury sales officer working in treasury sales, like the app that I was just talking about, software app for rental properties. Uh, Pardon me, the brain fog is starting to kick in. During my HR reorientation at Wells Fargo, now as a treasury sales officer, I don't know why I thought if T.S. Eliot could be a banker and a poet, maybe I could be too. I'll sell my soul during the daytime and then I'll write my poems at night. Maybe I can do that. It didn't quite work out that way. Just on the orientation, which was in a room full of about 30 other new hires, it was all done on a speakerphone with headquarters out of North Carolina. And the question asked to the entire room was, if anyone here is with a disability, I was immediately outed. I remember the head of HR looking at me and I was completely outed in my brand new job fresh out of grad school. That kind of set the precedent for accommodations in the workplace. Now, if you were an officer of the bank that pulled in the big clients, the money making clients, the commercial real estate developers around town, you could get any kind of ergonomically correct device you wanted. I could not even get ergonomically correct uh, typewriting as an admin support person. So, and it's only gotten worse since then. I think the fear of retribution is still where everything comes into play. I used to give people the benefit of the doubt and think maybe they just don't understand, but they do understand fully. And also, if they are becoming reactive, at least this is what I learned through dealing with a lot of narcissistic dynamics in my personal life, professional life, medical life. The people that have a problem with me asking for what I need and they get reactive, they never respected my boundaries in the first place, and in all likelihood, never respected me and valued me as a human being. So I'm not sure how to answer this question. I speak up now because it's not just about me. If my speaking up and speaking the truth helps anyone else to not have to go through what I have yet survived, then that's all I can ask. Thank you.
This is Kimberly, and I know that we're super, super short on time. I put a couple of comments into chat, and it has to come from the top down. I mean, if you employ the 1 in 4 principle that 1 in every 4 people has a disability, then you have to realize that that other 75% are people that are the friends, the family, the colleagues, the soccer teammates, the knitting club partners. It doesn't matter. You are impacted by disability in your life. And if the top understands that, if the leadership of businesses and organizations and companies and really just anything understands that people with disabilities are throughout their lives, and they might not even realize that, then they can start to embrace accommodation and accessibility within the practices that they use to operate their businesses. And so it has to start at the top. Otherwise, it's not going to filter down and it won't be a basic premise of the organization.
Thank you so much to our lovely panelists and to everyone who joined us today for this webinar on accommodations. I apologize that we ran out of time to do Q&A, but hopefully our panelists were able to speak to a lot of different aspects of accommodations, and I encourage anyone who does have questions to do a bit of research themselves. There's a lot of really wonderful people who are always talking about issues with disability, and the more people we have join those conversations, the better. Before we quickly wrap up, I would just like to highlight that we really appreciate your feedback. Your input helps us measure impact and improve future webinars. If you have the time and capacity, we ask that you complete a short post-webinar survey, either using the QR code on the screen or the link that I just sent in the chat. It should take you less than 5 minutes. And then finally, a quick reminder that today's session was recorded and will be uploaded to the Disability Empowerment Center's YouTube channel. So if you'd like to revisit the conversation or share it with others, you'll be able to access it there. I'll post that link in the chat as well. And we also hope you'll be able to join us next month for our Understanding Ableism webinar on June 16th, where we'll be discussing medications and access for people with disabilities and the relationship between science and health, safety, and access. So thank you all for being a part of this conversation, and have a great rest of your day.